Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar Fireside Chat. My name is Veena Vijaykumar. I'm BDC's Program Director.
And I'm Dan Greshkin. I'm BDC's Executive Director. Just to give you a little bit of context, the webinar series that we're now sitting in was created as a resource for participating students and instructors to create a common shared set of knowledge around biodesign. So today it's our fantastic, happy, wonderful, joyous honor to have two long-standing community members of BDC and Biodesign at large, Charlotte McCurdy and Megan Valanidas. Just to give you a sense of the program, Charlotte and Megan are going to speak first alone and then to each other for about 45 minutes. If you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. You can type them at any time. Veena and I will be logging them, and then during the last 5, 10, 15 minutes, we will basically MC those questions to Megan and Charlotte.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. And thanks for everyone for joining us. We're getting people in as we go. So yeah, please do drop in questions as we go. I'm going to do a very quick intro with both Charlotte's and Megan's bios, and then we're going to go right into it. So firstly, Charlotte McCurdy works at the intersection of climate change, speculative futures, and in experimental design. Her work with carbon negative algae bioplastics has been featured in many of the world's most influential design museums and publications. As a design strategist and sustainability thought leader, she has worked with startups, global brands, and government agencies to advance climate strategies. Megan Valanidas is an industrial designer specializing in bioplastic application and interactivity. Her work establishes and employs methods for designing our waste stream by collaborating with extra-human species, such as locally present decomposers. As a designer, researcher, and artist, Megan focuses on near-future and bio-inspired solutions. So thank you, both of you, Charlotte and Megan, for joining us. Please take it away.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my slides first and speak first. So I'll just jump right in to the joy of, can everyone see that? Great. Let me also get the chat up 1 second. Great. Okay. So I'm glad we've already warmed up the chat a little bit, because I'd love to hear from our participants. Can you give us 3 words or phrases in the chat that triangulate your interest in design, biodesign, or the world in general? What gets you fired up? Network systems. There's no right answer, obviously. Wild nature. Symbiosis. Grown, not produced. Ethics, disruption, new futures. Change now. Boom. Creativity, community, sustainability. All right. Keep that going. I want to reinforce what Veena said about, if you have questions, feel free to keep them coming in the chat. And also, if in this talk or in our dialogue, if ever there's like a phrase or word being used that you like wish could be defined a little bit more clearly, be sure to not note that in the chat, and we'll try to make sure that we're all sharing a common vocabulary, because that's super important. All right, alternative futures plus 111, complex system, natural entities, artificial entities. Okay, I'm gonna play along. So I'm Charlotte McCurdy. That's my haircut before the pandemic. My 3 words are probably climate change, futures, and design strategy. I'm currently an assistant professor of design at the Herbert Institute at ASU. And that's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me after this. I'm part of your community. Wait, let me move my little camera so that I'm like, look like I'm looking at you, not like I'm looking to the side. Okay, just to quickly introduce you to my practice, assuming no prior knowledge. If you've seen my work, you've probably seen this project. This is a collaboration that I did with Philip Lim to apply the algae plastic material that I developed to a dress. This project started right before the pandemic and then completed during the pandemic. So it became this very sort of correspondence-based collaboration for a very hands-on project. So it was quite surreal, but the purpose here was to, our task was to try to engage a new ambition for sustainability within fashion. And for me, with my interest in regenerative materials and carbon negative materials, how can we have the goalpost for sustainability in fashion be more ambitious than just organic cotton and recycled polyester? And right now, sequins, if you are a fashion designer who are incredibly intentional about every other material you use, if you reach for sequins, you're probably reaching for polyester. There really aren't good alternatives, and that's totally unnecessary in my view. That project grew out of this project, which is the raincoat that I made out of the plastic material that I developed, which I was really fortunate to have picked up to be in some museum shows, which let me sort of tell this story about alternative futures for plastics and alternative approaches to thinking about climate change through a more tangible and material-based lens. And that specifically helped me and was part of how I ended up at New Ink, which is where I met Dan and Dina as part of the incubator there. And more broadly, my practice outside of these like discrete objects that let me talk to audiences about climate change in new ways. I do a lot of really hands-on making and experimenting, very craft-based approach to experimentation, but then a lot of storytelling, communicating about that. But I come from sustainability strategy to design. So I'm sort of sit in a design strategy space, which lets me do things like be a delegate at COP26 and 27, helping industries think about how to decarbonize and how they're going to design and enact approaches to decarbonizing their industries. So that's in terms of like thinking about where biodesign and bio-inspired and ecosystems-based thinking can take you. Here's one strange little career, and we can talk more about any of that if that's interesting to you. I wanted to spend a second talking about working in a developing field, which biodesign certainly is. My work that led to the algae plastic project started from climate change. And this is a mapping of all of the emissions globally by source, by industry sector, and by gas output. And most of the way we talk about work on climate change is through energy and fuels for transport, because they are the biggest chunk. They're that like 60% in the top left there, the direct burning of fuels for the production of energy and kinetic energy through transportation. I got really interested in this last third category called direct emissions, which includes the chemistry of making materials. And I bring this up to say that being in a new field and finding sort of the edge cases, finding the stories that you're fascinated by, but you feel like other people aren't telling the story, that I feel like is a strong strategy. It's certainly one I recommend and I advocate from my own experience as a way to be contributing to the field, to be discovering things that are authentically new and potentially allowing you to give a gift back to the community. So I sort of went to this edge, thinking about direct emissions, embodied carbon in materials, and by focusing down on that edge case, was able to become what other people spurt and get to do what I like to do. So it's frightening to go out into the unknown, to be in ambiguous spaces, to not have clear paths to follow, but that's part of what being a leader is literally, and you can help each other along the way and help others who come into the space after you. As a biodesigner, if I am a biodesigner, I don't work with, I don't deal with DNA directly. I don't work with living cultures to make materials, but I'm certainly coming at the question of climate change, thinking on ecosystem scales and thinking about how natural systems have been metabolizing carbon and are part of why carbon is where it is. I'm also directly engaged with biomaterials and exploring making materials out of biomass feedstocks, precisely because of the potential carbon and climate benefits thereof. So in terms of possible evolutions that I see for biodesign, or if I were to give advice to young, inspiring biodesigners, I would say that there's something about scale and time scale. And as we start to think about life and what it's done to shape our built environment, there's so much we can learn from life. And it's like to not limit ourselves just to what is technologically possible, but to stay really curious about the nature of the world as it is. So this is just to speak quickly to, this is geologic time concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And this period right here, the Carboniferous period, you'll see this massive drop in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This Carboniferous period is a moment of evolutionary mismatch that happened in nature that caused major shifts in the location of carbon. So what happens here is plants develop the ability to produce lignin, incredible structural polymer, and it lets plants go up for the first time. So the landscape goes from ferns to trees for the first time. You'll see, this is pre-Pangea. So this is like a very ancient time. And this process of plants developing lignin, it takes 100 million years for the decomposers of the ecosystem to figure out how to break apart lignin. The trees go up, they fall over, and they accumulate. And that's where 90% of our coal comes from, is this evolutionary moment, right? So it's a geologic process, but it's interconnected with biology and changes in biology and evolution. And part of why I like to point to this example is that we can feel right now like humans are unprecedented in the impacts that we're having. But we're not the first form of life to develop a suite of complex polymers that nothing else can break down, right? But we probably don't want to wait 100 million years for nature to evolve the pathways to eat and metabolize the stored chemical potential energy of things like plastics. So just having some humility and some context on how we are part of nature, the things we are doing are not so alien, and maybe by thinking in these ways, we can find new ways through these problems. And this so this is photosynthesis. This is my very poetic description of photosynthesis. And this, I'll just leave you with one final little fun piece. Back to these connections to biology and landscape that feel non-intuitive to us. I got really interested in, part of what brought me into this project was learning about cement. Like, I always knew in the abstract that cement was a major contributor to greenhouse gases. It's like about 8 to 10%, depending on the year and who's doing the math. And that's the chemistry of making the cement. That's not how you heat the factory, anything like that. And what I found in that is that it's because cement, the core active ingredient in Portland cement, is made from limestone, CaCO3. To make that into an active ingredient that when you add water to, it'll recrystallize, you heat it up to crack off a CO2 for every single CaCO3. Limestone is mostly fossilized marine invertebrates, right? So we think of cement as this man-made material, but it's actually, like fossil fuels, a fossilized life. And carbon is so important, powerful. It's the scaffolding of all life. We are carbon-based, our DNA, everything, we are of carbon. Incredibly powerful atom for life to build all of its complex forms. Precious. And how can we treat it as precious? So this diagram, which is totally over the top as a data viz, but that tiny, each C represents an atmosphere's worth of carbon. So there's 720 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. Gigaton, great example of how scientific speak is not the way most people talk. Gigaton, billion ton. And we are justifiably terrified by the marginal changes in that little guy. There's 3 times as much carbon currently stored in terrestrial plants and soils. Deforestation we need to care about for a lot of reasons, but one is because there's carbon stored in it. And when we burn it to create more farmland, that carbon goes somewhere. You'll see oceans, the single largest carbon reservoir in the short-term carbon cycle in the biosphere. When you've probably heard that the ocean's been protecting us from climate change, it's absorbed about half of our emissions because it's becoming carbonic acid, it's acidifying the ocean. That's not great for life either. Fossil fuels, 6 times as much carbon as is in the atmosphere. This is not about running out of fossil fuels. This is about where it is, where it's been put by life over hundreds of millions of years. Carrageenans are the precursor chemicals to fossil fuels. They burn, they're just not as efficiently. And then sedimentary carbonates, this huge pool. That's what we're tapping into every time we're making cement. That's what marine invertebrate shells have put underground for so long. So just my final thought on where I hope or think and dream, and as I think about the future of biodesign. Industrial design, we think a lot, talk about human-centered design. And I'm curious, and maybe this can come up in the discussion, but is it possible? I'm curious about whether it's possible for us to actually engage in life-centered or ecosystem-centered design from our narrow subject position. Is there a way we can yoke these two things together and understand our own self-interest is so inextricably linked with the interest of non-human species? And I'll stop there.
I suppose it's my turn. Thanks, Dan and Vina. Thank you, Charlotte. That's so exciting. I always love your presentations. And it's really fun to get a chance to express, sorry, this light is distracting me now, but I think I'm out of it. But it's always really nice to have a chance to express my process, especially alongside Charlotte's, because you'll see they're very different, but they touch on the same topics in a very different method. So let's see if I can pull that up. Okay, fun. I remember. I feel like everyone's going to see it before I see it. That's it. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So I thought I would start by just saying a lot of what brought me into biodesign, and I'm very happy to find biodesign. As soon as I found the practice, it just clicked with me. I think all my work has always been centered in that direction. And the reason that is come from kind of 2 major events in my life, and ultimately what led me to industrial design. So I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay in a community founded by plant pathologists in the 1940s who were studying the blight of the American chestnut tree. So I was always surrounded by science, artists, and educators. Kind of a obvious life path for me. I found it in my own way. So now I work at the center of art, science, and education. Later, I worked as a farm apprentice in southern Maine. So on the right, you see some beautiful early morning images on the farm and in the fields. As an apprentice, I was an apprentice through MOFGA, Maine Organic Farming and Gardening Association. And as part of that program, we were educated in some traditional organic farming methods. And it was at that time that I realized the importance of soil and how much I cared about regenerating healthy soils. So put those 2 together, and that's where I ended up with this project. If you've seen any of my talks before, a lot of this information will be familiar. So I'll just briefly walk through it, even though there's a billion slides. I also kind of like that you guys can just kind of see the process as we go through. But this work, A Place for Plastics, is centered on the concepts around behavior change, how biomaterials can function within our ecosystems, which include people, current infrastructure, nature, which I believe we are always a part of. So how can we think of the systems that are always around us as potential advantages for the types of materials that are ending up in the wrong place. And when I say wrong place, I mean plastics in the ocean, anywhere where they're not being repurposed or brought back into a circular cycle. Such that, or the idea here being, can we work with materials or intentionally design materials and systems so that they're never out of place? They're always in the right place, even when they're acting out, being naughty in the edges. So thinking about thoughtless acts in terms of like, we're never perfect. There's no such thing as perfect, especially not in nature. So how can we design things that work with the same chaos that we all live within? So, and how can this work regenerate our soils? So really thinking about plastics as a way to be a potential feedstock. Again, not even again, but as we talk about biodesign, so this is an image of me thinking about, okay, these plastics being able to degrade into soils. How can we get there and what would that take? A lot of my practice is very intuitive driven, firsthand research driven, and just driven by curiosity, which I really appreciate with the Biodesign Challenge and this whole field that we really want to support. If you have a thought about what a way that the world should be or the way that products should exist in this world, it's a really exciting discipline to be able to explore how those pieces can fit in with a community of practicing designers or experimenting designers, to see how that could look and get incredible feedback. So I just want to say that a lot of this work is it kind of sits, and I know we'll talk about this after in our discussion, because Charlotte and I talk about this whenever we get the chance. This work sits a little bit in a speculative space, but it also sits in 1 foot in the present. So I like to describe how I think about my work in terms of what's happening today, very grounded now, and then 1 foot in the far future of just allowing for that place of risk-taking, exploration, experimentation. So this image is me just kind of briefly thinking about, well, what does that look like if you have single-use plastics? What are the potential waste streams that you could litter? I don't know that I really stand behind that word, because it's not even litter really. It's just like accidental falling out of place sometimes. I don't know that I've ever met a litterer. Compost, these are biodegradable products. Can they end up in the compost? That's a whole other field of question, right? Because there's industrial composters, there's backyard composting, there's compost that just happens on forest floors. So each of these moments or potential interventions for me this is a bit of a roadmap for exploration of this project. You can dive in at any point and just find a lot of design opportunities. The flush in the middle is very, very controversial, and not entirely, definitely not a direct, what's the word? Not my recommendation to be flushing your materials down the toilets, but I do want to bring that up because it was a far-fetched concept that led me down a path of discovering all the different systems that currently do exist in our infrastructure and what that does point to in terms of biomimicry, how we already are using biomimetic systems design in our infrastructures, and how we could potentially maximize those structures to function in a modern world with more complex challenges. So that's a little idea of how I think about how all of this waste could encounter decomposers, leading me to local bacteria, building soil, and then running back into renewable feedstocks or bio-based resources for materials. In the outcome of this work for me was really thinking about how these biomaterials need to look and feel, and how they need to look and feel completely different than current materials. A lot of times these materials are thought of as one-to-one replacements for our traditional materials, and it has become very clear to me but that is not the case. They function differently. They have different waste streams. They need to be understood in completely different manners, which is why I say a lot of this work is also around behavior change. Also, can I get I think I lost my time note. Can I get a sign from people? 5 minutes left. Yeah, about 5. Thank you. Okay. So I started really thinking about how can these materials look so different that they're immediately recognizable to a user. Not only are they recognizable to a user, that being the human-centered design component, but how can they be easily degradable by extra-human species, by decomposers? So a lot of the research then became, well, what is the preference of a decomposer when encountering these materials? This is for all young aspiring designers out there. I can't express enough how important it is to have your design principles clear so that your work can always be supporting what you're after. If you ever get lost, remember why you're there. So for me in this project and really in all my biodesign product work, it's about creating soil. And I think about soil as creating it needs to be easy, needs to be equitable, and we needs to be beneficial to all ecology. A lot of these images are process also to show you kind of how, hopefully it's relatable to you. A lot of it is kind of as very DIY. You make what you need to learn what you need to do. So this is my biohacking space where I was culturing local decomposers and introducing bioplastics, traditional plastics, and pre-marketed consumer eco products to see how they could be digested. I learned they were poorly digested, not at all. They're very inaccessible to decomposers directly. And I collected these decomposers by finding, by just swabbing outside directly under trash that I was finding in nature to say, how could they become compatible together? This is me visiting the local wastewater plant and learning all about the processes. So it's really a kind of sped up decomposition process at the wastewater plant. Really engaging in firsthand work. So maybe a lot of you out there also learn by doing. It really helps me to get out there and touch things, experience things firsthand. So I needed to find out what those decomposers look like, what the local bacteria look like, and really identify opportunities for breaking down. So clearly that influence, so wastewater coming into the wastewater facility is rife with decomposers and local bacteria. Seems obvious, but the visualization made it very clear that versus the wild samples out in the streets and the alleys, much more diverse. But I still think it would be wonderful if we could flush our trash and have it decompose on the way down. I don't know that we'll be there in my lifetime. Thinking about life cycles of plastics and all of biodesign really, and Charlotte did a very similar graph, just thinking about scales of time. Plastics, traditional plastics can be around from anywhere from 300 years to 5,000 years. Current biopolymers on the market still can be existing for up to 500 years. So when you think about like what's a reasonable amount of time for a product to last, I like to think about this sea turtle. Even at 100-year lifespan, we're overshooting the use of these materials heavily. And just to show you some more of my process, really identifying, even if we do have these materials, they're very difficult to recognize from traditional plastics. This is kind of where my work is today, working with corporate labeling nonprofits currently in North America to think about can we be really altering or creating policy change to allow consumers to re-understand these materials. So this is the kind of one foot in the present. So let go of the flushing your trash concept, even though it's very interesting, and focusing on the more kind of boots on the ground, like what are the paces and the step-by-step changes that we need to undergo as a culture, as a nation, in our infrastructures, to really start understanding how these materials need to be understood universally. So I'll jump through this stuff, and if anyone wants to hear more, I'm happy to talk about it. The fruit skins for me came out of this concept of understanding innately that what something, the touch, feel, look of a material that can be thrown out of your car window, that led me to translating these skins into potential textures, surface designs for single-use materials. And this is a kind of, what if we switched up and a potato chip bag is just clear? It's a very simple shift, but the aesthetic change is such that it completely changes the way that we interact with the snack. Same with all these objects. The fruit skins, the super fun part about using the fruit skins and applying those to different products is not only do they express change to the user, but they also can be more readily digestible by bacteria in the ecosystem. So they're already based off of a system, based off of a texture that was understood in nature. So also want to plug for biomimicry, and Charlotte and I were talking about this also yesterday. It can feel like something very technical or difficult to engage with, especially in product design. But I find that if you just keep exploring and keep going down the paths of all the questions that you have, you might find ways that nature is already doing something that you can use. Skip these, and just to say, what am I doing today? I'm a creative director with Altimeter Design Group. We do a lot of work in security, and I wanted to point out that security can also mean security, human security, eco-security, climate security. All of these issues are top of mind for me, and the way I think about them is from a systems kind of nature-based perspective. So I also wanted to plug that for our later our conversation coming up next, in terms of also Charlotte and I were talking about, are we biodesigners? I would say that I think in a biodesign way, and I approach projects in a systemic way, focused from nature. So it's just always there regardless of the work. And that work can include futures and foresight, creating, opening up creativity in new spaces in the government, spaces that can be quite risk averse, helping them to expand and think in terms of systems and think in terms of experimentation. It also comes out in terms of narrative artifacts. So how can we create pieces? And arguably my cup is largely a narrative artifact. I think that might be similar, Charlotte, to how you think about your raincoat, in terms of it may not be a solution, but it is a presentation to ground a conversation. So I work a lot in narrative artifacts, workshops, and experience design, also using nature to help expand. It's a great way to expand thinking, using abstraction to draw out deeper thinking, complex thinking, but by combining new thoughts. And this is a piece a team of mine did for the Biodesign Challenge. So I would also share, it is a wonderful experience just to engage in any of the sprints. This was a very systems-based piece that we came up with for the Biodesign Google sprint a year or two ago. So just to express in this one, we really wanted to talk about how we felt that the cloud was an insufficient metaphor for how we are connected to our data. And instead, we wanted to borrow from natural systems. So we borrowed from the littoral zone, thinking about land and sea, nutrient cycles. How can our human and data interaction be more closely understood? And how can that metaphor be expanded in ways that would assist companies and corporations with allowing consumers to know innately where to bring their devices and what system they're engaged in? So this speaks to transparency, greenwashing, trying to keep everything quite visible for consumers. And again, my favorite thing would be systems design. So we realized that in biodesign and with nature, it's all about the system. So how can we create systems that people innately fall in love with? That's it. Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna just start having a conversation between the two of us, but please be populating the chat with any questions. We're gonna open. I don't know if you can hear my dog right now. We'll open up the conversation more broadly. Megan, I feel like there's so many pieces of what you just brought up that I feel like I could grab onto. But maybe I'll start with something that we discussed in advance as being, we were talking when we were prepping for this, we were talking about like what we feel like should draw people to biodesign and biomaterials, and like what we feel like the so what of biodesign is. I'd love to spend some time with that. Because it seems like from the chat, there's a lot of, it seems like this group has a lot of so what, like in terms of being motivated and seeing the possibility in biodesign, but I'd love to spend a second there. I think for me, the short answer is that like I come to this space from the problem I'm passionate about. It sounds like you do too, right? In terms of like the crisis in soil and soil degradation is what brought you naturally to these ways of working. And I feel similarly like coming from climate and emissions, it's a tool for working on these big problems. So that to me is always something like, it's not an end in itself. It's a approach, it's a process that can be so powerful.
I agree. We also were talking about the accessibility of these concepts and how they can feel like very inspiring, but difficult to apply directly to your work. And I don't know, sometimes it feels like there's too much. Sometimes it feels like I don't know where to start, or it's not quite a connect with what I'm thinking. But I think my big message with the so what is not enough people are designing with nature front of mind or carbon sequestration front of mind. And just the simple act of holding on to these North Stars as a guidance, as a guide in your practice, changes the design outcomes and changes the world that we live in drastically if you continue following down that path. So for me, even using these methodologies is a huge shift in our current disciplines. I like saying that here because we have an audience, so I just hope everyone heard that. Like, anything you can do to be working with nature is always going to shift the needle. But also, I'm, that's my, like, I'm excited. That's what motivates me to work. And I also know there's a lot of hard work in there, but I'd love to hear your reaction.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about part of what you just said about how things change, right? With like small changes in starting point, the outcomes change. And even just the difference in our work, we had two different starting points in terms of the core crises we're interested in, and end up with almost diametrically opposed views on normal. And like that in order for it to the end of life to be handled properly, it needs to look really different. Whereas my starting point from climate being like, we need people to accept and adapt and be drawn to these materials, so that I need to make it look as normal as possible. And not to say that like that's the destination, right? In industrial design history, there's a concept of Maya, most advanced yet acceptable, which is sort of a mid-century Lowy concept that I use sometimes to help maybe justify, maybe post-rationalize this choice. But Maya, most advanced yet accessible is a assertion, not necessarily based on like robust psych studies, but that for any new technology, you can't start with the future full on, like what this thing could be, that if you go there, you're going to, it's alienating, it's frightening, it's too far, it's too foreign. But if you could offer the most advanced yet acceptable version of the technology, people can understand it because it can graft onto what they already know and understand. And this happens with all kinds of technologies in terms of like skeuomorphic reference points, like using filing waste baskets that people recognize to label a digital pocket that is not literally, so there's all kinds of examples of this. But it's interesting that because we had different starting points, we ended up with really different conclusions on that, even just that one variable. So there's, I guess, why do I bring this up? That like, there's no one way that these processes and approach will lead, right? Because it's like adaptive to each challenge and each approach.
Yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Charlotte. For people who don't know, Charlotte and I have worked alongside each other for years, so it's a very interesting topic, I think, for us both. So what I would say to your comment about Maya, I completely agree, and actually we were just talking about that in our course. What I think about, there are so many levels of change that need to occur in order to shift the conversation, policy. We talk about will for change. One of those levels are the consumer understanding of a change. I think that's what the kind of like original Maya concept was directed towards. Like, okay, it's not too much. Great, got it. I accept it, even though I would prefer that my iPhone had much more changes. And I'm a big fan of the concept. Another layer within the many echelons of change that are needed is just inspiration and the people that are left trying to push those changes. I've found that this work has, the Place for Plastics work has put me in places being able to talk with people in different capacities. So I'm not necessarily speaking to the public at large in terms of accepting this bubbly cup, but I am able to speak to people that are in positions to react to policy change or make those changes, and it advances, at least in my experience, I've seen that it advances the thinking and the certain internal levels in terms of narrative objects. So for instance, there's a labeling guidelines document. This is like, can be very boring, but it's very interesting to me and my kind of packaging interest. The labeling guidelines document is very safe, very middle of the road, very plastics, bioplastics should look green and brown and green striped. I agree completely, Charlotte, and your work is so inspiring in terms of how beautiful it is and how we can use beauty to really push and attract attention, push interest. I think in that same way, I'm trying to use experimental thinking and risk-taking thinking to open up spaces of dialogue and open up spaces of exploration. So I completely agree, and it didn't even solidify for me that you and I might be after different moments in change. I'm glad you brought that up.
And I think that that reinforces part of what you said so eloquently about like knowing what your core is and being able to return to that as a designer. When you showed your diagram that's centered around soil health, I think the analog to that is knowing what I might call your audience, but like knowing who your work is for. Because like if you have because we do, I think your insight there is that we're trying to pull levers that are in different places in these sort of cultural social ecosystems of consumers versus decision makers, policymakers.
And they all need to be pushed. Yeah.
Our babysitters have come back, so I want to.
Hi, we're here. I just wanted to what I've been trying to do, as both of you have been speaking, is try to map your processes and your interests to each other. There are a lot of similarities, and I'm hearing similar trends in what you're both saying. Charlotte, you were talking about human-centered design early on in your talk, and basically saying moving from a human-centered to maybe an ecosystem-centered or decentered way of thinking. And then, of course, referring back to Megan and you going back to the sort of your core values and what you're designing for. It was interesting to hear you say that if you start to consider the ecosystem, or maybe, yeah, I would say the ecosystem or nature or the environment in your design work, it starts to change like what you're doing and how you're designing. Can you kind of give us a picture of where we are in the state of design? How are designers thinking about human-centered design? Is there this shift happening? Is this something that needs to be pushed more? And then how do we push it?
Yeah, I'll pick that up first, because I think if any of you are familiar with industrial design or design thinking or the way it's been popularized, the sort of mantra of human-centered design as being the way to drive innovation, it has its record of producing things that were valuable and people valued, right? But it's literally anthropocentric. It is saying that designing for what an individual in this timestamp, what they desire, that's the ground floor of what like good design would be. So there definitely are lots of conversations, lots of pushes around trying to find a way to do life-centered design or ecosystem-centered design to zoom out from that sort of solipsistic individual and like feeding their like moment to moment desire for gratification, because that obviously produces lots of problems at scale and across time. But I'm actually part of my sort of beef, to use a weird metaphor in this context, but I'm a bit suspicious of our ability to think in an ecosystem-centered way, because we are trapped in our point of view as humans. And cynically, like if we can't even show consideration, kindness, and empathy to other humans, how do we expect to be able to do it for other species? Right. So I sometimes turn back to human-centeredness in that maybe we can motivate us to care about non-human life by framing it and thinking of it in terms of its value to humans. And like it's I don't have a good answer there, but there's a tension I see. So yes, there's tons of work, tons of people trying to find ways to be life-centered, to be sustainability-centered, but I don't think it's been really like solved yet. So it's a really active space to think in and work in for anyone on this call.
Thank you for that excellent primer, Charlotte. I couldn't agree more. Another tenet that is very strong in industrial design is the understanding that if you're designing for a community, that community must be present in the design, must be able to have a say in that design. So the issue we're up against in ecosystem design is we don't speak all the other languages out there in nature. I recently was working on a speculative project about kind of courtrooms in the future where nature could have translators, and there could be law degrees that would be focused on a framework around like how nature views its needs. Because I couldn't agree more. We do need to shift and expand our view to ecosystem-centered design or extra human-centered design. But how do we do that without engaging directly, observing, listening, paying attention to what nature needs? It's very tricky and very wonderful area to be involved in.
Do you have any advice on how? I mean, it sounds impossible, right? Because nature isn't one species, it isn't one thing. You favor one species over another, and you might see a spike in one population and then decline in another. So, it seems like a challenge all the way across in terms of determining just the most simple thing, like what are you valuing most here when you're designing?
It's,
I mean,
there's
that's the
lots of-
reason.
okay.
Oh, good. I'll just be brief. That's the reason I was swabbing dirt and growing out the bacteria in my kind of biohacking space. I wanted to meet those things and start understanding what they liked. So I don't know that it's I definitely think it's possible. This is another time where I'll kind of take the easy way out and just say, like, you know, industrial designers, we're generally interdisciplinary, but there's so many other researchers working in and biologists. We need to bring them to the table so that we can learn from what they're already observing and learning in nature.
Well said.
Yeah.
Charlotte, I know you have some, I know you were gonna say
I
something.
just wanted to underline part of what you said about like focusing the species we focus on, because like the things that are charismatic and legible to humans are such a vanishingly small slice of the life that's out there. Like, I think there's a great piece of meta-analysis around like the overrepresentation of like tigers in research versus like nocturnal marsupials, like just let alone microbes, let alone things that trigger taboo in us. So yeah, I think being suspicious of our own gaze, taking a little bit of time to sit in that is important. But I think we should probably, or should we open up to questions? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just about to say that we have a lot of questions to sort
Some of
through.
which I think were
Yeah, good.
So Vina, do you want to kick it off? There are a number of them.
I'm looking to see which ones, because I think you all touched on several of these as you were speaking, so.
I mean, I see some questions about bioplastics in general that I think actually both of you can answer. You know, we've been talking to bioplastics now for decades.
Yeah.
Some are already on the market, some are yet to see market penetration.
Some are 100 years old.
There you go. Right. At least. Well, I mean, once you start thinking of wood as a biomaterial, it's over. Right. There you go.
Well, but I'm thinking in particular about like rayon viscose acetate, which are cellulosic and wood-based, and biodegradable.
So I guess the question is from Jennifer is why have we not seen it as much in our daily lives as we could?
I can pick that up with in terms of modern bioplastics. When you look at something like PLA, for instance, which is one of the major modern bioplastics, when that was first developed, polylactic acid, you know, made from milk, when that was first developed, it's where it found application in the market was as resorbable suture material, right? So you think about like how little material can produce how much value to not need to open back up a surgical site, because it was expensive to make. And it took quite a while. And actually, as I read the history, a little bit of perverse action from a employee who the Cargill didn't want to, who controlled part of the patent process, didn't want to push PLA farther. And someone who worked there, like, I think my understanding is like literally did some experiments in his garage because he couldn't get permission to do it at work, and figured out a way to have to make it more economical to produce. And then here we are with 3D printer spools and to-go plastic cups and all kinds of new applications for PLA. So commercialization is highly connected to cost, especially when you're competing against commodity price and you're competing against conventional plastics, which are a co-product of fossil fuels and artificially cheap thereby. It's really hard. So as we shift away from fossil fuels, that calculus might also get fairer. But that's me being overly economical in my thinking.
I would only add to that all the processes would need to shift significantly. I mean, depending on which materials are then become prioritized, depending on the market, commercialization, kind of who gets there first on the race. All these materials, for anyone who's played with them, work very differently, are formed very different in a very different manner than our traditional materials that we have today. So just consider all of the heavy machinery that's in place, that's been in place, how that would need to be back engineered, updated, completely swapped out. It's a huge shift, and it's one I'm excited to see.
And just as an example of that, in terms of how technology does not exist in isolation, it's building on a history of technology. You remember that, like, why is the automobile the width it is? Not because that's the size people are, it's because of the width of two horses side by side. Right? Horses defined the carriages, defined the roads, and now we are creating new cars into a legacy infrastructure that is literally formed by a technology that's no longer part of the system. Like, we can't even move the needle on that. So it's like, no technology exists in isolation. It's part of a broader history of processes and infrastructures.
I'm going to go into Savannah. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. This was referring to Megan's presentation, I'm pretty sure. Referring back to your slide with your biomimetic plastic, I'm curious about the choice to remove familiarity of feel from these materials. If the goal is to target consumer behavior and this design's origin is in familiar natural material, why do you petition for a different look, smell, touch for your materials?
Oh, sure. Thank you. I didn't spend too long on the slide that was kind of the trouble with doubles, where it was like, here's a PLA cup and here's a maybe corn syrup, corn derived cup. One's biodegradable, one's recyclable. This came from my research visiting local composting facilities and discovering how easily the different waste streams are contaminated. So consumers are faced with a choice. And when you're finishing your drink and kind of tossing it in the waste bin, I don't have the percentages, but it was causing enough of an impediment that entire waste streams were being stopped from even moving into a compost facility, similar to a recycling system not being recyclables, not being clean, so they can't be used. With these materials that are nearly identical to each other. It's still causing a lot of confusion for consumers. So that was my thought, was can the aesthetic shift in such a way that it not only signals to the consumer, but also signals to nature. This is.
I lost you, Megan.
Okay. I see there are questions about bioimagery in the post, and I'm sort of gonna kind of squeeze them together a little bit.
Can you all still hear us?
Yep.
Okay, you both like squinted at us at the same time. So it's like, do we cut out?
I think we're reading.
Okay, understood.
So I guess the question is, where does biodesign and biomimicry meet? How do you incorporate both of them in your work? How do they fit into this idea of some sort of ecosystem-centered design? Yeah, how does it work? And I guess maybe the better question is, how does it work in your processes?
I think for my work in the carbon removal space, the carbon removal how do we actively pull carbon out of the atmosphere? We're at a point where there's already too much carbon dioxide or its equivalents in the atmosphere. More than 95% of the IPC strategies for staying under 1.5% rely on carbon removal technologies that have not been developed or commercialized or brought to scale yet. So there's this it's not just like we need carbon removal so we can keep emitting. Like it's we need to both stop emitting and remove carbon. And in that space, it's like, yeah, sure, we could build giant HVAC systems and we need to probably, like, not to speak of it, but also, like, if I asked a group of engineers to create a ecologically beneficial, self-replicating, self-healing system for removing carbon from the atmosphere, we don't need to invent that. Like, plants are fantastic. Algae, the reason I focus on algae is because it is one of the most efficient photosynthesizers at converting solar energy into useful molecules. The question becomes, how do we make sure that we're not getting into food versus fuel? We're not, like, we're taking food crops and making them into materials, because we're already, as humans, using so much of, that's what that global map is the net primary productivity, the global photosynthesis. So that's somewhere between biomimicry and biodesign, right? Because it's working with organisms, wild type organisms, to try to achieve a function, but also acknowledging biomimetically the ways in which life is built around carbon, and has low energy, low heat, low effluent ways of capturing carbon, which is sort of more of a biomimetic form. But I don't quite use these words to hold on to different parts of my thinking. So maybe that's why my language is disorganized.
Same. I don't have a clear line there. I guess I more think of biomimetics as a kind of input or resource, a way to learn about nature, the way nature solves things. And then biodesign for me is an application of that knowledge. So that might be like the most designer response you can get for all you engineers out there, but that's how I think of them. As a biodesign is where I put it, and biomimicry is kind of how I learn, a way of thinking about that ecosystem-centered design.
Can I ask one last question? This is more of a practical question for someone who's trying to get into the world of biodesign or do their first work in biodesign. You know, if you were to meet maybe a high school student or someone who's just you know, in college, and they say, hey, I want to try my first biodesign project, I want to step into this, what would you say, what would you recommend for them to do?
I would say two things. Go ahead.
Go for it, Charlotte.
I would say two things. The first is, to the point Megan brought up, identifying your core and your passion and what challenges you want to care about. Because like any technology runs the risk of like leading us into what it wants to do, right? And being able to stay grounded in what the world, what we really need from technology, and to have us lead technology, not be led by technology. So getting really clear about your core. And then two, I would really pragmatically recommend like getting your hands dirty, like hands-on as quickly as possible, and learn as quickly as you can from precedent. So maybe that means like following a recipe, doing a thing, like wrap your head around what's been done as quickly as you can and get unintimidated about it, so that you can find that space that's been underexplored where you can make something new and contribute and have it be directly connected to what you're passionate about and what you want to see done more of in the world. Like with a project, it doesn't exist because you haven't done it yet. Like, and learn from what's been done so you can get there as quickly as you can. But repeating or following, there's too much good work to do. We don't need too much of that.
A great start. That's a great, thank you, Charlotte. So exciting. I get so revved up listening you talk. I would also say a really great, I've encountered students that think, well, you know, where do I start? What does this mean? It's too big to tackle. Along with finding your specific view. I'd say this is something that the creative world shares with all other fields. Go out there and observe, get in nature, whatever that means to you, and look around, take note, have a observation sketchbook, start just making note of the different systems that you're seeing, any gaps that you're seeing, something that might be inspirational, and then use the field of biomimicry to fill in some of that information and lead you down your paths of inquiry, because you're going to, through that observation, come up with really big questions. The other thing I want to say about why I love this practice and I love this field is nature doesn't lie. Nature is very honest. If you think you have a product, you know, I don't know how many times people have seen like a product pitch and telling us how great it is. If you put it in nature, it will tell you how great it is, if it works, if it's functioning. So use that honesty to inspire your work as you're investigating your own questions and curiosities.
I think
That's a
that's
great way to end.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, thank you both for your time. Thank you to everyone that joined us. If there are additional questions, I guess we could, do you all have socials that people can follow and reach out to you and things like that? If you want to drop it in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, that was wonderful and inspiring.
Yeah, it is. I think it's been a pleasure for us from the Biodesign team to watch your trajectories as in your careers as designers,
Mhm.
and cheer you on from the sidelines. So yeah, I'm glad we finally got to have you, speak to the community in this forum. Hopefully many more times ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. We love this group. Thank you.
Yeah, and webinars are great, but there's so many great people in this room, and I just want to say hi.
Yes.
Reach out. Don't be a stranger.
Thank you all. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.